Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're talking about Micronesia, and before you ask, no, not the region, the actual country, the Federated States of Micronesia, which is somehow both everywhere and nowhere at the same time, because here's the thing that broke my brain when I started researching this. Micronesia has more ocean than some countries have land. We're talking about a nation scattered across an area of the Pacific roughly the size of the continental United States, except the actual land you could walk on would fit inside New York City. It's like someone took a handful of islands, threw them as hard as they could across the world's largest ocean, and then said, yep, that's a country. And if that wasn't wild enough, some of these islands are literally the tips of underwater mountains taller than Everest, while others are rings of coral barely 2 meters above sea level, which means climate change isn't some distant future problem, it's a please stop rising or we'll cease to exist kind of situation. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're listening from tonight. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We're doing every country on Earth, and trust me, they all have stories this strange. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. A geography lesson that defies logic. Alright, let's start with the most important fact about Micronesia. It barely exists. I don't mean that philosophically. I mean that if you took all the land that makes up the Federated States of Micronesia and combined it into one chunk, you'd have something smaller than New York City. About 700 square kilometers total. That's it. Except here's the catch, that 700 square kilometers is scattered across 7 million square kilometers of open ocean, which means roughly 99.9% of Micronesia is water. You could sail for days without seeing land. You could be in Micronesia and have absolutely no idea because you're just staring at waves in every direction like some kind of existential maritime nightmare. The name Micronesia comes from Greek mikros and nesos, meaning small islands, which is accurate but also feels like an understatement. It's not just small islands. It's 607 islands spread across an area so vast that if you tried to drive across it at highway speed, you'd be in the car for like 50 hours. Assuming you had a car that could drive on water, which you don't, because it's the Pacific Ocean. Only 65 of those 607 islands are actually inhabited, which makes sense once you realize that most of them are either tiny coral atolls with no fresh water or volcanic rocks sticking out of the sea like geological middle fingers. Now, Micronesia isn't just one thing. It's 4 states, Yap, Chuuk, Pohnpei, and Khosrae, each with its own character, its own history, and its own very strong opinions about how things should be done. Think of it as a federation held together by mutual interest and the fact that being tiny island groups in the middle of the Pacific doesn't give you a lot of negotiating power on the world stage. Yap's in the west, known for stone money and traditional culture. Chuuk's got the lagoon with all the World War II shipwrecks. Pohnpei's the wettest, most mountainous, and has ancient ruins that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about isolated island societies. And Khosrae's off doing its own thing in the east. Lush and quiet and shaped like a sleeping woman if you squint at the mountains right. Let's talk about what island actually means here, because there are 2 very different types. First, you've got the high island's volcanic peaks that punched up through the ocean floor millions of years ago and decided to stick around. Pohnpei, Khosrae, and the main islands of Chuuk are high islands. They've got mountains, rivers, actual soil you can farm, and enough rainfall to make you wonder if the sky has a vendetta. Then you've got atolls, which are a completely different beast. Atolls are rings of coral that formed around volcanic islands that have since sunk back into the sea, leaving behind a lagoon surrounded by a necklace of low-lying reef. Most of the Marshall Islands are atolls. they're beautiful. They're also an average of 1 to 2 meters above sea level, which means every typhoon is a dice roll, and every conversation about climate change is deeply personal. Pohnpei is the flagship. It's the capital state, home to the town of Palikir, and it is aggressively wet. We're talking about one of the wettest places on Earth. The highland areas get over 10 meters of rain per year, 300 inches. That's not weather. That's a geological feature. If you're standing on a mountain in Pohnpei during the rainy season, you're not experiencing rain, you're experiencing what it's like to be inside a waterfall that forgot to turn off. The island is blanketed in rainforest, so dense you could walk 10 feet off a trail and be completely lost. Waterfalls everywhere, mangroves choking the coastline, and in the middle of all this wet green chaos, you've got Nan Madol, an ancient city built on artificial islands out of massive basalt logs stacked like some kind of Polynesian fever dream. We'll get to that later, but just know, Pohnpei does not do anything halfway. Chuuk, sometimes still called Chuuk, depending on who you ask and how old their maps are, is built around one of the most spectacular lagoons in the Pacific. Picture this. A protective barrier reef forming a rough circle about 50 kilometers across, and inside that ring you've got over 200 islands, most of them volcanic and mountainous and covered in jungle. The lagoon itself is enormous, over 2,000 square kilometers of sheltered water. It's stunning. It's also a graveyard. During World War II, the Americans sank a massive chunk of the Japanese fleet here, and now Chuuk Lagoon is one of the world's premier wreck diving destinations. You can swim through cargo holds of rusting ships and see fighter planes resting on the seafloor like toys someone forgot to put away. It's beautiful and haunting and a little bit surreal. Yap is the most traditional of the 4 states, and it's famous for one very specific thing: stone money. I'm not talking about coins. I'm talking about massive limestone discs called rai. Some of them the size of car wheels with holes carved in the middle so you can theoretically roll them around or carry them on poles. Except you don't actually move them. The stones just sit there, sometimes for generations, and ownership changes hands based on oral agreements and social consensus. It's a monetary system that runs on trust and collective memory, which sounds insane until you realize that's basically how all money works. We've just outsourced the bookkeeping to banks and blockchain grifters. Yap's also known for its manta rays, its traditional navigation techniques, and a cultural conservatism that's managed to survive colonialism, wars, and the slow creep of globalization. Khosrae is the quiet one, the easternmost state, the most isolated. The island's shaped like a reclining woman. Locals call it the sleeping lady, and once you see the mountain profile, you can't unsee it. Khosrae's incredibly lush, rainforest everywhere, barely any flat land. The coastline's fringed with mangroves, and the interior is all steep ridges and valleys choked with vegetation. There are ancient basalt ruins here too, at a place called Lelu, which suggests that Khosrae was once home to a pretty sophisticated society before European contact turned everything upside down. These days it's the least populated state, and it likes it that way. It's quiet, it's green. It's the kind of place where you can hear the rain hitting the leaves and feel like the rest of the world is on a different planet. Now let's zoom out and talk about the ocean, because the ocean is the main character here. Micronesia sits in the western Pacific, roughly east of the Philippines and north of Papua New Guinea. The nearest major landmass is the Philippines, about 2,500 kilometers to the west. Hawaii's about 4,000 kilometers to the east. Australia's way down south. Basically, Micronesia is in the middle of nowhere, which made it incredibly difficult to find if you were a European sailor in the age of exploration, and incredibly difficult to leave if you were an islander without modern navigation tools. The distances between island groups aren't trivial either. You could sail for days between Yap and Pohnpei. Cosrae's off on its own, far enough east that it might as well be in a different time zone, which it is. And here's something that'll mess with your sense of scale. Some of these islands are sitting on top of volcanic mountains that rise 11 kilometers from the ocean floor. The Mariana Trench, the deepest point in Earth's oceans, is right next door. So you've got islands that are barely above sea level sitting next to underwater mountains taller than Everest, which then drop off into an abyss so deep that if you sank Mount Everest into it, the peak would still be over 2 kilometers underwater. The Pacific doesn't mess around. It's the largest ocean on the planet, covering about a third of Earth's surface. And Micronesia is just a handful of geological accidents scattered across its expanse like someone playing the world's least efficient game of darts. The climate is tropical, which is a polite way of saying it's hot and humid all the time. Temperatures hover between 27 and 30 degrees Celsius year-round. There's a wet season and a slightly less wet season, but dry is a relative term when you live on islands that get typhoons on a semi-regular basis. Chuuk, Yap, and Pohnpei sit right in the typhoon belt, which means every few years a massive storm rolls through and reminds everyone that living on a tiny island in the middle of the ocean is a lifestyle choice with consequences. The atolls have it worse. When you're only a meter or two above sea level, a storm surge isn't an inconvenience. It's an apocalypse. Waves wash over the entire island. Salt water floods the wells. Crops die. And then you wait for the rain to replenish your fresh water supply and hope the reef protected enough of your coastline that you still have a place to live. Fresh water is a whole thing on atolls. There are no rivers, no lakes, no aquifers in the traditional sense. You've got a thin lens of fresh water that sits on top of the denser salt water underground, and you access it by digging shallow wells. But it's fragile. One bad storm, one period of drought, and that lens shrinks or gets contaminated. So you rely on rain catchment roofs, tarps, barrels, anything that can collect water when it falls. It's a precarious way to live, and it makes you very aware of the sky. On the high islands it's easier. Pohnpei has rivers, Cosrae has streams. You can build infrastructure. But even there, you're aware that everything depends on rainfall, and rainfall depends on weather patterns, and weather patterns are increasingly doing things they're not supposed to do. The marine environment is extraordinary. The coral reefs around these islands are some of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. We're talking hundreds of species of fish, sea turtles, sharks, rays, octopuses, crustaceans, mollusks, the whole underwater circus. The reefs aren't just pretty, they're essential. They provide protein, they protect the coastline from storm surges, they support the entire food web, and they're dying. Coral bleaching from rising ocean temperatures is hitting these reefs hard. When the water gets too warm, the coral expels the symbiotic algae that gives it colour and nutrients, and it turns white. If the temperature doesn't drop, the coral dies, and if the coral dies, the fish leave, and if the fish leave, people go hungry. It's a cascade, and it's happening now. Resources are limited. There's no oil, no significant mineral deposits. Some atolls used to have phosphate from centuries of bird droppings, but that got mined out decades ago. Fishing is the main resource, both subsistence and commercial, though overfishing and illegal foreign trawlers are constant problems. Arable land is scarce, especially on the atolls. You can grow taro, breadfruit, coconuts, bananas, traditional crops that don't need much space and can handle the salt spray. But for everything else, you import. Rice, fuel, manufactured goods, medicine, it all comes from somewhere else. which makes Micronesia incredibly vulnerable to global supply chain disruptions and price fluctuations. It's the kind of economic fragility that keeps government officials up at night. And then there's the isolation, the psychological weight of being this far from everywhere. If you're on Pohnpei and you need something that's not available on the island, a specific medical treatment, a spare part for a machine, a book that's out of print, you're waiting for a shipping container or a flight, and both are expensive and irregular. The internet exists, but it's slow and patchy. You're connected to the world, but there's a delay, a friction, a constant reminder that you're on the edge of things. For some people, that's freedom. For others, it's a cage. Either way, it's Micronesia, an improbable nation built on improbable geography, held together by ocean, history, and a collective agreement that this ridiculous arrangement somehow works. Chapter 2. How to cross an ocean with nothing but stars and Audacity. So here's the question that should keep you up at night. How did people get to Micronesia in the first place? We're talking about islands scattered across millions of square kilometres of open ocean, with no land bridges, no visible landmarks from sea level, and no logical reason for anyone to think, yeah, let's just sail east for a few weeks and see what happens. And yet, roughly 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, people showed up, not by accident, not by getting blown off course in a storm. They showed up on purpose, with canoes full of supplies ready to settle, which means someone looked at the biggest ocean on the planet and said, I bet there's land out there, and then convinced a bunch of other people to risk their lives on that hunch. That's not exploration. That's faith backed by astronomical knowledge and an unreasonable tolerance for risk. These first settlers were part of the Austronesian expansion, a massive human migration that started somewhere around Taiwan or Southeast Asia and spread across the Pacific like the slowest, wettest game of tag in human history. They brought pottery, agricultural crops, outrigger canoe technology, and a navigation system so sophisticated it makes GPS look like a participation trophy. The Western Islands were settled first, Yap, the Palau area, the Western Carolines, and then people kept going east, island by island, generation by generation, always pushing the horizon. By the time they reached the furthest edges of Micronesia, they'd been sailing for centuries, refining techniques, memorizing star charts in their heads, and building a culture that treated the ocean not as a barrier but as a highway. Let's talk about navigation, because this is genuinely one of humanity's great achievements, and it doesn't get nearly enough credit. Micronesian and Polynesian navigators could cross thousands of kilometres of open ocean with pinpoint accuracy using nothing but observation and memory. No compass, no sextant, no charts. They had what's called a star compass, a mental map of where specific stars rise and set on the horizon throughout the year. During the day, you read the swells. The ocean has patterns. Long-distance swells travelling in consistent directions. Interference patterns where swells bounce off islands and create ripples you can feel in your canoe. You watch the bird species like frigate birds return to land at night. So if you see them heading somewhere at dusk, there's an island within range. You watch for stationary clouds over invisible islands, the colour of the water, the smell of vegetation on the wind. Combine all of this into a mental model of where you are and where you're going. And if you're good, you can sail from Yap to Pohnpei without ever losing your way, which is absolutely bonkers when you consider that Pohnpei is a tiny dot in an ocean the size of a continent. The canoes themselves were works of engineering brilliance. Outrigger designs a main hull with a smaller float attached by spars to one side, which provided stability in rough seas without sacrificing speed. They were built from breadfruit wood, sewn together with coconut fibre, sealed with breadfruit sap, no metal, no nails, just wood, rope, and knowledge passed down through generations of canoe builders. Some of these vessels could carry dozens of people, plus food, water, livestock, and planting materials. They weren't just boats, they were arks. Entire communities packed into floating boxes, betting everything on the navigator's ability to find land before the food ran out. And it worked, which tells you something about both the skill of the navigators and the sheer determination of people willing to leave everything behind for a chance at something better, or at least different. Once people arrived, they adapted fast. The high islands offered forests, rivers, volcanic soil. You could grow taro in the valleys, breadfruit in the lowlands, fish the reefs for protein. On Pohnpei, they developed pile-driving agriculture, raised beds in swampy areas so crops wouldn't drown in all that rain. On the atolls it was harder. Limited fresh water, thin soil. You relied on coconuts, pandanus, breadfruit if you were lucky. You fished constantly. You learned to read the lagoon like a book. Survival wasn't guaranteed. It was negotiated, season by season, storm by storm. Each island developed its own culture, its own political structure, its own relationship with the ocean and the land. Yap became famous for its stone money, which is maybe the strangest monetary system ever devised by humans and also maybe the most honest. Here's how it works. You sail 400 kilometers to Palau, where there's a specific type of limestone. You quarry massive discs from the rock, some of them 3 or 4 meters in diameter, carve a hole in the middle, and then transport them back to Yap by canoe, which is, let's be clear, insane. These things weigh tons. Getting them on a canoe without sinking is a feat. Getting them across 400 kilometers of open ocean without losing them to a storm is a miracle. And here's the best part. Once you get the stone back to Yap, you don't move it. It just sits there. Ownership changes hands based on oral agreements and communal memory, but the stone itself stays put. There's even a famous rye that sank during transport and is still considered valuable despite being on the ocean floor. Why? Because everyone agrees it's valuable. Which again is how all money works. We've just gotten really good at pretending otherwise. Pohnpei developed the most centralized political system. Around 1100 CE, the Saudeleur Dynasty rose to power, and they went hard. They built Nan Madol 92 artificial islands on a coral reef off the eastern coast of Pohnpei, connected by a network of canals like some kind of tropical Venice, except made of basalt instead of marble. Each platform was constructed from massive logs of columnar basalt, stacked like giant Lincoln logs, with some of the individual stones weighing several tons. No one knows exactly how they did it. There were no wheels, no draft animals, no cranes. Theories range from raft transport to lever systems to sheer brute force and an unlimited supply of labour. Whatever the method, it worked. Nan Madol became the ceremonial and administrative centre of Pohnpei, a monument to centralised power and the ability of one dynasty to reorganise an entire island's resources around a single ambitious building project. The Saudeleur Dynasty ruled Pohnpei for about 500 years, and by most accounts they were not particularly beloved. Centralised control, tribute systems, food production managed from the top down. Legends describe them as tyrannical, possibly magical oral traditions. Say they could levitate the stones, which is a poetic way of saying, we don't understand how they move those things, so maybe sorcery was involved. The dynasty controlled the island through a combination of political manoeuvring, religious authority, and architectural intimidation. Nan Madol wasn't just a city, it was a statement, a physical reminder that the Saudeleur had the power to command thousands of labourers to haul rocks across the island for decades. That kind of centralised power doesn't usually end well, and it didn't. Around 1628, a warrior named Isokelekel from Khosrei, which is a long way away if you're travelling by canoe, sailed to Pohnpei and led a rebellion that toppled the Saudeleur Dynasty. The details are murky because we're working from oral histories filtered through 4 centuries of retellings, but the broad strokes are clear. The Saudeleur were overthrown. Isokelekel established a new ruling structure based on the Nan Madol system, a more decentralized arrangement, with multiple chiefs sharing power, and Nan Madol was gradually abandoned. The islands are still there, slowly being reclaimed by mangroves and moss, and they're absolutely worth visiting if you ever find yourself on Pohnpei with a boat and a sense of adventure. Walking through those basalt corridors is surreal. It feels like you're trespassing in a place that wasn't meant for the living, which, to be fair, is accurate. Khosrei had its own thing going on. Around the 1400s, they built Leilu, another basalt city, similar in construction to Nan Madol but with its own architectural quirks. Royal compounds, religious centres, evidence of a hierarchical society with enough surplus resources to invest in monumental construction. Khosrei doesn't get as much attention as Pohnpei, partly because it's more isolated and partly because the archaeological work has been less extensive, but the ruins are just as impressive. It's another reminder that these weren't simple island societies scraping by on fish and coconuts. These were complex chiefdoms with sophisticated political systems, long-distance trade networks, and the organisational capacity to pull off engineering projects that still baffle archaeologists. Chuuk took a different path. The lagoon was never unified under a single authority. Instead, it was a patchwork of chiefdoms spread across the islands, each with its own leadership, its own alliances, and its own grudges. Warfare was common. Raids between islands, disputes over fishing rights, land, insults real or imagined. It wasn't large-scale organised warfare, think skirmishes, not armies, but it was persistent enough to shape the culture. Fortified villages, warrior traditions, a social structure that prized navigation skills and combat prowess in roughly equal measure. Chuukese navigators were renowned across Micronesia, which makes sense when you consider that if you grow up in a lagoon with 200 islands, you're either going to learn to sail or you're going to have a very small world. Most people chose sailing. Yap, meanwhile, was building something closer to an empire, and I use that term loosely because it wasn't a military empire in the traditional sense. It was a trade and tribute network that stretched across the Caroline Islands, based on a system called Seiwei, a complex arrangement of reciprocal exchange that's hard to translate into modern terms without losing the nuance. Outer islands provided Yap with goods-woven textiles, shells, food, and in return, Yap offered protection, prestige, access to stone money, and participation in a network that connected you to other islands. It wasn't conquest. It was more like a franchise agreement, except the franchise was cultural capital and the product was belonging. The system lasted for centuries, adapting and evolving until colonialism showed up and replaced it with something much less interesting. Social structures across Micronesia were generally matrilineal. You inherited your clan identity and land rights through your mother's line. This gave women substantial social power, even in male-dominated political systems. Clans managed land collectively. Chiefs were usually hereditary, but their authority was tempered by councils of elders and the need to maintain legitimacy through generosity. A chief who didn't redistribute resources, who didn't host feasts, who didn't mediate disputes fairly, that chief didn't stay chief for long. It was hierarchy balanced with reciprocity. Religion was animistic and deeply tied to the landscape. Spirits inhabited mountains, reefs, stones, trees. Ancestors were venerated and consulted for guidance. Sacred sites dotted the islands, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin. Priests and ritual specialists held knowledge that was transmitted orally, never written down, and they played a crucial role in everything from navigation to agriculture to conflict resolution. Taboos regulated behavior. Certain reefs couldn't be fished during spawning season. Certain foods were restricted to specific clans. Certain places were off-limits to outsiders. These weren't arbitrary rules. They were environmental management strategies wrapped in religious authority. And they worked because breaking a taboo meant risking not just social sanction but spiritual consequences. Daily life revolved around the ocean. Fishing was constant reef, lagoon, deep sea for tuna and mahi-mahi. Communal drives where entire villages would corral fish into nets. Canoe building was an essential skill involving not just woodworking but an understanding of hydrodynamics that would make modern engineers nod in respect. Weaving was an art form. Tattoos indicated clan affiliation and status. On Pohnpei, sakau, a drink made from pepper plant roots, similar to kava, was central to ceremonies. It's mildly psychoactive, tastes like muddy water, and the ritual of preparation absolutely cannot be screwed up if you want to avoid social embarrassment. Inter-island contact was regular. Trade networks connected the islands. Stone money travelled west to east. Shells the other direction. Marriage alliances linked chiefdoms across hundreds of kilometres. Stories and legends spread and adapted. Languages diverged but remained related. You could usually make yourself understood even if the accent was different. It was a connected world, held together by voyaging canoes. You could stay on your island and live your whole life within sight of the same reef, or you could build a canoe and see what was over the horizon. Most people chose both. Population estimates for pre-contact Micronesia are rough at best. Pohnpei might have had 10 to 20,000 people at its peak. The total across all the islands was probably somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000, though those numbers are educated guesses based on carrying capacity and later historical records. What we know for certain is that the populations were stable, the societies were functional, and the culture was rich enough to produce monumental architecture, sophisticated navigation techniques, and social systems that managed resources sustainably for centuries. This wasn't a primitive backwater waiting for civilization to arrive. This was civilization, just a different kind. One that measured wealth in stone discs and navigational knowledge instead of gold and written language. And it was working just fine until someone showed up with a flag and a very different set of ideas about how the world should be organized. Chapter 3. When Europeans arrived and immediately made everything worse. So that sophisticated society we just talked about, the one with the stone money and the navigation expertise and the monumental architecture, European contact, hit it like a sledgehammer. And the thing is, the Europeans barely even tried. They just showed up, claimed ownership of everything they could see, introduced a bunch of diseases nobody had immunity to, and then mostly wandered off to exploit other parts of the Pacific. It was colonialism on autopilot. The first documented European contact was Ferdinand Magellan's expedition in 1521. They sailed through, noted some islands on their charts, and kept going. The Spanish decided this meant they owned the place, named it the Islas Carolinas after King Charles II, and then proceeded to ignore it for the next 300 years, which would be funny if it weren't so devastating because even absentee colonialism has consequences. For centuries, Spain's control over Micronesia was purely theoretical. They'd send the occasional trading ship, maybe a missionary or two who'd set up on an island, try to convert people, and usually get frustrated by the lack of interest in abandoning perfectly functional belief systems for Catholicism. Most Micronesians went their entire lives without seeing a Spanish official, which honestly sounds great until you realize that Spain's actual contribution was creating a legal framework that other European powers would later use to justify their own claims. It was colonialism as a placeholder. We're not using this, but we're calling dibs anyway, and if you try to use it, we'll get mad. In 1899, after losing the Spanish-American War, Spain sold the Caroline Islands to Germany for $4.5 million. Just sold them, like you'd sell furniture. Nobody asked the people living there if they wanted to be sold. That's not how empire works. But before the formal colonial period really got going, there was a messier, more chaotic phase of contact. Whalers started showing up in the 1700s and 1800s crews from America, Britain, Australia, stopping to resupply, trade, and occasionally cause trouble. Then you had beachcombers sailors who deserted their ships or survived shipwrecks and just decided to stay. Some integrated into island communities, learned the languages, married locally. Others were disasters who introduced alcohol, firearms, and a whole catalogue of European vices. And everyone, intentionally or not, brought disease: smallpox, influenza, measles, typhoid. Micronesians had no immunity to any of it. The population crashes were catastrophic. Estimates suggest some islands lost 50 to 90% of their people within a few generations. Entire villages were wiped out. Social structures collapsed because the elders who held the oral histories died before they could pass the knowledge on. It was a demographic apocalypse, and most of it happened before the colonial powers even bothered to show up in force. Missionaries were part of this early wave. The Catholic attempts, backed by Spain, had limited success. The Protestant missionaries, mostly from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, did better, arriving in the 1850s and 1860s and setting up on Pohnpei and Cosray in particular. They brought literacy, education, and Western medicine, which sounds positive until you realize the cost. Missionaries opposed basically everything traditional: polygamy, sakau drinking, traditional dances, immodest clothing, the entire existing cultural framework. They preached salvation but practiced cultural erasure. Women who'd worn grass skirts and gone bare-breasted for centuries were suddenly told their bodies were shameful. Ceremonies that had connected people to their ancestors were labelled devil worship. The intricate system of taboos that had regulated fishing and preserved reef health got replaced with Christian commandments that had nothing to say about sustainable resource management, and it worked, to an extent. Many Micronesians converted, partly because Christianity offered answers in a time of upheaval, and partly because resisting the missionaries meant resisting the colonial powers backing them. Churches were built. Traditional ceremonies were abandoned or driven underground. The sacred became profane, and the profane became sacred, and an entire cosmology got rewritten in a single traumatic generation. Germany took formal control in 1899 and immediately got to work being more efficient colonizers than Spain ever was. They set up a proper colonial administration in Colonia on Pohnpei, built infrastructure, introduced taxation, and restructured the economy around copra-dried coconut meat that could be processed into oil and shipped to Europe for use in soap, margarine, and cosmetics. If you're thinking, that sounds like turning a diverse subsistence economy into an export monoculture that enriches foreign companies while making locals dependent on cash income, you'd be absolutely right. Copra production is back-breaking work. You harvest the coconuts, you split them, you dry the meat in the sun or over fires, you load it into sacks, you haul it to the docks, and then it gets shipped to Germany, processed by German companies, sold in German markets, and the profits go to German shareholders while you get just enough wages to stay alive and keep working. The plantations required labour. The Germans weren't shy about making that labour compulsory. You worked the plantations, you paid your taxes, you did what the colonial administrators told you to do, and if you didn't, there were consequences. Traditional authority structures were systematically dismantled. Chiefs who'd once held real power found themselves reduced to intermediaries between their people and the German bureaucrats. Land tenure systems were disrupted. The gift economy and reciprocal exchange networks that had regulated island life for centuries were replaced by wage labour and market transactions. You couldn't just fish and farm and participate in the community anymore. You needed money. And to get money, you worked for the Germans. It was a dependency trap, and it was by design. The traditional navigation knowledge started fading because ships made long-distance voyaging unnecessary. Western clothing replaced traditional dress. Christian moral codes replaced the old taboo systems. And the oral traditions, the stories, the genealogies, the navigation techniques, the accumulated wisdom of 3,000 years were being lost as elders died and young people were told the old ways were primitive and irrelevant. Resistance happened, but it was risky. The most dramatic example was the Saudeleur Rebellion on Pohnpei in 1910 and 1911. The Germans had banned sakao, suppressed traditional practices, and forced the people of Saudeleur district to provide labour for infrastructure projects. The colonial governor, a man named Bode, was by all accounts an arrogant tyrant who treated local leaders with open contempt. The Saudeleur people had enough. They rebelled, they killed Bode, and for a brief moment it looked like maybe they could actually push the Germans out. But Germany sent a warship, they bombarded Saudeleur. They captured the rebellion leaders, held a quick trial, and executed them. Survivors were exiled to Palau. The district was effectively depopulated. It became a cautionary tale. Resist, and you don't just lose, you get erased. The trauma from the Saudeleur Rebellion echoed through Pohnpeian society for generations. You can still feel it if you talk to people from that area. Some wounds don't heal, they just scar over. World War I broke out in 1914, and Japan, allied with Britain and smelling opportunity, seized German Micronesia almost immediately. The League of Nations formalized Japanese control in 1920 under a mandate system that was supposed to be about developing the islands towards self-governance. In practice, it was colonialism with better PR. Japan initially presented itself as a benevolent administrator, fellow Asians helping Micronesians modernize. The reality was different. Japan wanted Micronesia for strategic reasons, control of the Pacific, naval bases, economic resources, and they were willing to invest more heavily than the Germans ever had. Roads, schools, hospitals, administrative buildings. It looked like development, and in some ways it was. But development in service of empire is still empire. The infrastructure was built to extract resources and project power, not to benefit Micronesians. The copra economy continued under Japanese rule, but Japan also introduced new crops and industries: sugar, fishing, mining where it was viable. They brought in Japanese settlers to manage plantations and businesses, creating a demographic shift that further marginalized Micronesians in their own lands. The cash economy deepened, more wage labor, more taxes, more dependency on imported goods. Traditional subsistence practices persisted in the background, but they were increasingly supplemented, and sometimes supplanted by participation in the colonial economy. If you wanted manufactured goods, medicine, education for your children, you needed money. And money meant working within the system Japan had built. It was a slow form of assimilation, not forced exactly, just made inevitable by the structure of the world you were living in. By 1900, the population of Micronesia had collapsed to perhaps 10 to 15,000 people, down from maybe 50 to 100,000 before contact. The numbers are rough because nobody was keeping reliable records, but the trend is clear. Disease did most of the killing, but social disruption, loss of traditional knowledge, and the psychological weight of watching your world get dismantled also took a toll. Think about what it means when half your village dies in a single epidemic. The farmer who knew which taro varieties grew best in which soil, the navigator who could read the stars, the healer who knew which plants treated which ailments, the storyteller who carried your clan's genealogy back 20 generations, all gone in a matter of weeks. And you're left standing in the ruins, trying to remember what they knew, trying to piece together fragments of knowledge that were never meant to be written down because they were supposed to be passed from teacher to student over years of apprenticeship. Some islands were completely depopulated and later resettled by people from other islands, which disrupted traditional land claims and created resentments that still bubble up today. When an entire generation of elders dies in a plague, you lose more than people. You lose the living library they carried in their heads, navigation techniques, herbal medicine, oral histories, all gone. Some of it was preserved, much of it wasn't. It's a cultural apocalypse that's hard to overstate. The environmental impact was quieter but just as real. Copra plantations meant monoculture. You clear the forest, plant coconut palms in rows, and harvest them year after year. It's efficient for export but terrible for biodiversity. Introduce species rats from European ships, new plant species, animals brought for food or work disrupted existing ecosystems. Reefs got damaged by ships and anchors. Overfishing in some areas as the cash economy pushed people to extract more than they needed for subsistence. The islands had been managed sustainably for thousands of years, but that system was based on traditional taboos and communal resource management. The colonial economy had no interest in sustainability. It wanted extraction, maximized output, short-term profit. The long-term consequences were somebody else's problem, preferably somebody brown and distant who the colonizers would never have to face. Cultural adaptation happened in the cracks. Christianity didn't completely erase traditional beliefs, it got blended with them in ways missionaries would have hated. Ancestor spirits became saints. Old sacred sites were reinterpreted as Christian holy places. Traditional ceremonies continued in private, disguised or underground. Languages persisted despite pressure to adopt Japanese or German or English. People found ways to maintain identity even as the structures of their world were being dismantled. It was resilience, but resilience under constant pressure, the kind that leaves you functional but exhausted. You're still standing, but you've lost things you can't get back. The Yap Sawe system, that tribute network that had connected outer islands to the Yapese core for centuries, started breaking down under colonial rule. The Germans and Japanese treated islands as administrative units, not as participants in a reciprocal exchange network. Traditional inter-island relationships were disrupted. Trade routes that had existed for generations got replaced by colonial commerce. The stone money on Yap continued to hold cultural value, but its role in the broader economic system was fading. The rice stones sat in their places, ownership changing hands the old way, but the world they'd been created for was disappearing. It's a strange kind of loss. The artifact remains, but the context is gone, so it becomes a museum piece in its own homeland. Technology came with the colonizers, and it was a double-edged sword. Steel tools replaced stone and shell, which made work easier but also made people dependent on imports. If your steel machete breaks and you've forgotten how to make a shaladzee, you're stuck. Western medicine saved lives but created dependency on doctors and drugs that had to come from elsewhere. Motorized boats were faster and more reliable than sailing canoes, but they needed fuel and maintenance. Every technological upgrade came with a hidden cost. You gained convenience. You lost autonomy. And slowly, generation by generation, you became reliant on systems you didn't control and couldn't maintain without outside support. It's how colonialism works. Not through overt force, though, there's plenty of that, but through 1,000 small dependencies that make independence unthinkable. You can't go back to the old ways even if you wanted to, because the knowledge is gone and the world has changed. So you move forward into a future you didn't choose, shaped by people who never asked your opinion, and you try to salvage what you can from the wreckage. Chapter 4. The War Nobody Asked For and the Peace That Wasn't. If you thought the German colonial period was bad, Japan said, "Hold my sake," and proceeded to turn Micronesia into a laboratory for how to erase a culture while calling it development. The League of Nations mandate was supposed to be about preparing the islands for self-governance. That was the theory. The practice was Japan using Micronesia as a strategic military outpost and settler colony, flooding the islands with Japanese immigrants until Micronesians became minorities in their own homeland. By the 1930s, Japanese settlers outnumbered Micronesians in some areas, especially around Chuuk Lagoon. Think about that. 400 years after the first human settlement, 3,000 years after people had been living there continuously, Micronesians were suddenly outnumbered by people who'd arrived in the last decade. It's colonialism as demographic replacement. You don't need to kill everyone if you can just import enough of your own people to make the original inhabitants irrelevant. Japan went hard on economic development, but the benefits flowed overwhelmingly to Japanese settlers. Copra production expanded, sugar plantations were established, especially in the northern Marianas. Commercial fishing fleets operated out of newly built harbours. Phosphate mining happened on islands where deposits existed. Roads, airstrips, communication infrastructure, all built using Micronesian labour, all serving Japanese interests. Micronesians worked as cheap labour on Japanese-owned plantations, in Japanese-run businesses, building Japanese infrastructure. The wages were better than under the Germans, which isn't saying much, but the dynamic was the same. You worked for someone else's profit, in your own homeland, under a system you had no say in creating. And if you wanted access to the modern economy, manufactured goods, medicine, education, you played along. There wasn't another option. The Japanese education system was a particularly effective tool of cultural assimilation. Japanese language was mandatory in schools. Micronesian children learned Japanese history, Japanese customs, reverence for the emperor. Traditional practices were dismissed as primitive. Christianity was tolerated because it had already done the work of undermining indigenous belief systems. But Shinto shrines were built, and Japanese cultural norms were promoted as superior. A generation of Micronesians grew up speaking Japanese better than their native languages, knowing more about Tokyo than Nan Madol, more disconnected from their own cultural heritage than any generation before them. It's a kind of colonialism that works through education. You don't ban the culture outright, you just make it irrelevant. Teach kids that their ancestors' knowledge is backwards, that progress means adopting the colonizers' ways, and let generational turnover do the rest. By the mid-1930s, things got darker. Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in 1935, which meant they no longer had to pretend the mandate was about Micronesian welfare. The islands became a closed military zone. Foreign visitors were forbidden. Fortifications went up on key islands. Chuuk Lagoon was transformed into a major naval base, the so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific, with harbours expanded, fuel depots built, ammunition stockpiled. Airfields appeared on islands that had barely had roads a decade earlier. Communication stations, defensive bunkers. Japan was preparing for war, and Micronesia was going to be on the front line whether Micronesians wanted to be or not. Spoiler, they didn't, but nobody asked. World War II officially reached Micronesia after Pearl Harbor in 1941, but the militarization had been underway for years. Micronesians were conscripted into labor battalions. They built defenses, dug tunnels, moved supplies, maintained airfields. They didn't get a choice. You worked for the Japanese military, or you faced consequences. Food was requisitioned for the war effort, which meant civilian populations went hungry while the military stockpiled rice. Fishing was restricted because the waters were military zones. Farms were destroyed to build fortifications or abandoned because the men were conscripted. The traditional subsistence systems that had kept people fed for centuries were systematically dismantled, and nothing sustainable replaced them. The war turned islands into military installations, and the people living there became logistical problems to be managed. Chuuk Lagoon was the jewel of Japan's Pacific defences, a massive natural harbour protected by a barrier reef, deep enough for the largest warships, with dozens of islands inside the lagoon providing land for bases and airfields. The Japanese Imperial Fleet used it as a staging area for operations across the Pacific. Hundreds of ships, thousands of troops, mountains of supplies. It was supposed to be impregnable. And then, in February of 1944, the Americans launched Operation Hailstone. Over 2 days, February 17th and 18th waves of American carrier-based aircraft hit Chuuk with everything they had. Bombs, torpedoes, strafing runs, the sky filled with aircraft. The water erupted with explosions. Ships that had survived battles across the Pacific were torn apart in minutes. They sank roughly 60 ships, destroyed over 270 aircraft, killed thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers. The lagoon became an underwater graveyard in 48 hours. Ships that had been the pride of the Japanese Navy were resting on the bottom, their hulls torn open, their crews entombed inside, cargo holds full of supplies that would never be delivered, fighter planes that would never fly again. It was devastation on an industrial scale, and it happened so fast the Japanese couldn't mount an effective defense. The smoke could be seen for miles. The sound of explosions echoed across the islands for 2 days straight, and when it was over, Chuuk's effectiveness as a military base was finished. After Hailstone, the Americans decided Chuuk wasn't worth invading. They destroyed its effectiveness as a base. Why waste lives taking it when you could just bypass it, cut off the supply lines and let the garrison starve? It was the island-hopping strategy: take the islands you need, bypass the ones you don't, and let Japan's overextended empire collapse under its own weight. So Chuuk, Yap, Pohnpei, and other heavily fortified islands were left to wither on the vine, which sounds strategic but meant prolonged suffering for everyone trapped there. No supplies coming in, no way to leave. Japanese soldiers and Micronesian civilians stuck on islands that were being bombed periodically but never invaded. Starvation set in. People ate whatever they could find. Coconuts, fish if you could catch them, wild plants, eventually things you wouldn't normally consider food. It was slow-motion catastrophe. Other islands weren't so lucky. Peleliu in Palau saw one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Marianas were invaded with massive casualties on both sides. Micronesians were caught in the middle, literally. They weren't combatants, but they were on the battlefield. Bombs fell on them. Artillery hit their homes. Some were killed by American fire. Some were killed by the Japanese for suspected collaboration. There are stories of Micronesians hiding downed American pilots, giving them food and shelter, and being executed by the Japanese when it was discovered. Other Micronesians were forced to fight alongside Japanese troops or face execution. They had no agency, no meaningful choice. They were just there, in the wrong place at the worst possible time, watching great powers destroy their homeland over strategic interests that had nothing to do with them. Japan surrendered in August 1945, and Micronesia changed hands again, fourth colonial power in less than 50 years. The United States took control under a UN trusteeship agreement signed in 1947, creating the trust territory of the Pacific Islands. The word trust is doing a lot of work in that title, because the agreement was supposed to be about preparing Micronesia for self-governance, but the US military had other ideas. Micronesia was strategically located between America and Asia. Control of these islands meant military advantage in the Pacific, and with the Cold War ramping up, that advantage was non-negotiable. So the US rebuilt some infrastructure, established schools teaching English instead of Japanese, set up hospitals and harbours, and ran the place like a colonial possession while insisting it was temporary stewardship. The post-war conditions were grim. Infrastructure was destroyed. The population had been reduced again by war, starvation, and disease. Japanese settlers were repatriated, which solved the demographic replacement problem but left gaps in the economy because many Japanese had been running businesses and services. Relief supplies came in. The Americans weren't monsters, and they understood that starving populations made bad PR, but the fundamental dynamic didn't change. Micronesians were subjects, not citizens. They had minimal self-governance. Officials were appointed by the US, not elected by the people. Decisions about land use, economic development, military installations, all made by Americans for American interests. It was colonialism with a friendlier face and better dental care, but it was still colonialism. And then there's the nuclear testing. The Marshall Islands, which are part of the broader Micronesian region, became the United States' proving ground for atomic weapons. In 1946, the US evacuated the people of Bikini Atoll, promising they could return once the tests were done. That was a lie. Operation Crossroads detonated atomic bombs over the lagoon. Later tests were even bigger. Castle Bravo in 1954 was the largest nuclear weapon the US ever tested, 15 megatons, 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The fallout spread far beyond the predicted zone. Marshallese people on neighbouring atolls were exposed to massive doses of radiation. Birth defects, cancers, thyroid problems, entire communities contaminated. The US documented the effects, studied the victims like lab rats, and called it science. The official justification was that the tests were for the good of mankind. Mankind apparently didn't include the Marshallese people whose islands were rendered uninhabitable and whose bodies were poisoned for generations. Micronesia's strategic value to the US was never in doubt. It's a barrier between America and potential adversaries in Asia. Control these islands, and you control vast stretches of the Pacific. Kwajalein Atoll became a major US military installation and missile testing range. Guam, which the US had controlled since the Spanish-American War, became a permanent territory with massive military bases. The Northern Marianas eventually became a commonwealth. Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands remained under US administration, their futures to be determined later, which is a polite way of saying, when we're done using them for military purposes, we'll think about independence. The trust was supposed to prepare them for self-governance, but the US was in no hurry. Strategic interest trumps self-determination. That's how empire works. The cultural landscape by the late 1940s was a mess of overlapping influences. Older Micronesians spoke Japanese. Younger ones were learning English. Christianity was fully established. The missionaries had won that battle decades ago. Traditional practices survived, but they'd been pushed to the margins. You performed traditional ceremonies in private if you knew how, if anyone still remembered the proper way to do them. Cultural identity had become complex and layered. A mix of indigenous traditions, Spanish Catholicism, German colonialism, Japanese imperialism, and American post-war reconstruction. Trying to figure out what it meant to be Micronesian in 1950 required navigating a century of trauma and adaptation. The younger generation was increasingly disconnected from pre-contact traditions. The knowledge was still there, held by elders, but the transmission was breaking down. Kids were learning about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln in school, not about the Saudeleur Dynasty or the navigators who'd crossed the Pacific using only stars. The environmental damage from the war was staggering and permanent. War debris covered the islands. Unexploded ordnance bombs, shells, grenades still scattered in jungles and reefs, still dangerous, still killing people decades later when someone stepped on the wrong piece of rusted metal. Reefs had been bombed. Ships had leaked oil. The sunken vessels in Chuuk Lagoon still contain fuel and chemicals that slowly leach into the water. After the war, the US dumped chemical weapons offshore, burying the problem in the ocean rather than dealing with it properly. The nuclear tests left islands uninhabitable, contaminated soil, irradiated water, ecosystems destroyed. The war had turned Micronesia into a toxic waste site, and cleaning it up was never a priority because the people suffering the consequences had no political power to demand action. The ocean would dilute it, the jungle would grow over it, out of sight, out of mind, except for the people living there, for whom it was neither. Japanese settlers were gone, repatriated after the war, which meant Micronesians were once again the demographic majority in their homeland. But the population was still recovering from a century of disease, warfare and starvation. Birth rates started climbing in the post-war period as stability returned and medical care improved. But the damage had been done. Entire lineages had been wiped out. Knowledge had been lost. Social structures had been shattered and imperfectly rebuilt. And now, under American administration, a new pattern was emerging. Migration. Some Micronesians were moving to US. Territories Guam, Hawaii looking for economic opportunities, education, escape. It was the beginning of a diaspora. The islands had always been home. But home was increasingly a place you left if you wanted a future. That's what colonialism does. It doesn't just change the place. It changes the relationship people have with the place. It turns home into a location you're from, not a place you can build a life. And that wound, unlike the others, never really heals. It just becomes part of the landscape. Chapter 5. Independence, sort of, and the art of surviving in someone else's world. By the 1960s, something was shifting. Micronesians who'd been educated in American schools, who'd grown up under US administration, who'd watched their islands be used as strategic assets for someone else's Cold War, they started asking uncomfortable questions. Questions like, why don't we have a say in our own governance? And when exactly is this trust going to lead to self-determination? The US had been running the trust territory of the Pacific Islands for 2 decades, and the preparation for independence looked a lot like indefinite colonial administration. So in 1965, the Congress of Micronesia was established, the first elected legislature. It was a start. Not independence, not real power, but a space where Micronesians could at least talk to each other about what they wanted their future to look like. And it turned out they didn't all want the same thing. The trust territory was huge and diverse. The Northern Marianas wanted closer integration with the US. They eventually became a commonwealth, basically choosing to remain American. Palau had its own concerns, particularly about remaining nuclear-free, which was a hard sell to a US military that wanted maximum strategic flexibility. The Marshall Islands wanted recognition and compensation for the nuclear testing that had poisoned their islands and their people. And the Caroline Islands Yap, Chuuk, Pohnpei, Cosray had to figure out if they wanted to stay together or go their separate ways. Different languages, different histories, different levels of enthusiasm for unity. It's like trying to build a nation out of states that barely knew each other and had spent the last century being told what to do by foreigners. The odds were not great. Negotiations for something called the Compact of Free Association began in 1969. It took 17 years to finalize. 17 years of back and forth about land rights, military access, financial compensation, sovereignty, and what independence even means when you're a collection of tiny islands in a strategically important ocean, and the world's most powerful military wants to keep you in its sphere of influence. The US didn't want to give up control, but overt colonialism was bad optics in the post-colonial era. The solution was the Compact, a unique arrangement where Micronesia would be technically independent, but freely associated with the United States. The US would provide defense, economic assistance, and migration rights. In return, Micronesia would allow strategic access, deny military access to US adversaries, and essentially remain in the American orbit. It was independence with an asterisk, sovereignty with conditions, freedom, sort of. In 1986, the Federated States of Micronesia officially became independent. 4 states, Yap, Chuuk, Pohnpei, Cosray, federated into a single nation with a capital in Palakir on Pohnpei. Population roughly 100,000, spread across 600 islands, most of them uninhabited. They had a constitution, an elected president, a congress. They had a flag and a seat at the United Nations. They were a country, except the US was still responsible for their defense. And the US was providing about $100 million a year in economic assistance, which was a substantial chunk of the government budget. And Micronesians could live and work in the United States without a visa, which sounds like a benefit until you realize it creates a brain drain where anyone with skills or ambition leaves for better opportunities, depopulating the islands. Independence came with so many strings attached it's hard to say if it was independence at all, or just a rebranding of colonialism with better PR. The Marshall Islands got their own compact the same year, with different terms because of the nuclear testing legacy. The US acknowledged some responsibility for the radiation exposure, some not full, and provided additional compensation, which sounds reasonable until you learn that Marshallese communities are still dealing with cancers, birth defects, and environmental contamination decades later, and the compensation has never come close to covering the damage. There's a concrete dome on Enewetak Atoll called the Runit Dome, where the US buried radioactive soil and debris from the nuclear tests. It's cracking. It's leaking. and it's threatened by rising sea levels, which means there's a very real possibility that a containment structure full of nuclear waste will be breached by the ocean and spread contamination even further. The US says it's the Marshall Islands problem now. Sovereignty, remember? You wanted independence. Congratulations, the radioactive waste is yours to manage. Palau took even longer. Their independence didn't come until 1994, and the delay was because of a fight over a nuclear-free constitution. Palauans wanted to ban nuclear weapons and nuclear-powered ships from their territory. The US wanted the option to bring nuclear vessels in if needed. The issue went to multiple referendums. There were political assassinations, violence, intimidation. Eventually, the constitution was amended, the compact was approved, and Palau became the last trust territory entity to gain independence. It was messy, it was traumatic, and it highlighted the fundamental tension of the compact arrangement. You're independent, but only as long as your independence doesn't conflict with US strategic interests. If it does, well, we'll have to work something out, and work something out usually means the small island nation compromises. The economic reality of the compact is that it creates dependency. For the FSM, compact funding represents 30 to 40% of the government budget. That's not supplemental aid. That's foundational. The private sector is weak. Economic development is limited. Tourism is minimal because the islands are remote and expensive to reach. Fishing license fees from foreign trawlers bring in revenue, but illegal fishing is rampant and enforcement is nearly impossible across such a vast ocean area. Remittances from Micronesians living abroad in Hawaii, Guam, the US mainland, are a significant source of income for families back home. So the economy runs on foreign aid, fishing licenses, and money sent back by people who had to leave because there weren't opportunities at home. It's not sustainable. But changing it requires economic development, which requires investment, which requires either aid or private capital, and private capital isn't exactly rushing to invest in remote Pacific islands with limited infrastructure and small markets. The migration provisions of the compact are a double-edged sword. Micronesians can live and work in the US without a visa. For individuals, that's opportunity. Access to education, jobs, healthcare. For the islands, it's a hemorrhage. The educated leave, the ambitious leave, the young leave, and they don't always come back. There are large Micronesian communities in Hawaii, Guam, and the West Coast. They send money home, which helps. But the islands are losing population, especially working-age adults. Some outer islands are practically abandoned. Schools close because there aren't enough kids. Hospitals struggle because there aren't enough patients to justify the expense. It's a demographic crisis happening in slow motion, and the more people leave, the harder it is to build the kind of economy that would give people a reason to stay. It's a vicious cycle. Migration creates the conditions that make more migration necessary. Governance in the FSM is complicated by the fact that it's a federation of very different states. Yap, Chuuk, Pohnpei, and Kosrae have distinct languages, customs, and priorities. The national government has limited power. The states guard their autonomy jealously. There's been a recurring secession movement in Chuuk, the most populous state, because some Chuukese feel they're not getting their fair share of resources and would be better off independent. Multiple referendums have been proposed. None have succeeded yet, but the sentiment persists. It's hard to build national unity when the states barely identify with each other, and the whole federation was kind of thrown together by historical accident and US administrative convenience. Democracy functions, but it's fragile. Small populations mean politics is deeply personal. Nepotism is common. Corruption exists. though it's not worse than many other small island nations. Institutional capacity is limited, and traditional leadership structures exist alongside democratic government, which creates tensions about who actually has authority. Infrastructure is a chronic problem. Roads are crumbling, airports and harbours need upgrades. Inter-island transport is difficult and expensive. If you need serious medical care, you're evacuated to Guam or Hawaii, which costs a fortune. Education quality varies wildly. Internet is patchy. Everything depends on shipping, which is expensive and irregular. You're waiting for containers to arrive with supplies. Sometimes they're late. Sometimes things spoil. It's island life in the 21st century. But the romance wears off when you're trying to run a government and you can't get the materials you need because the supply chain is held together by hope. And then there's climate change, which for atolls is an existential threat, not metaphorical, literal. Rising sea levels mean some islands may become uninhabitable within decades. Storm intensity is increasing. Salt water is intruding into freshwater lenses, contaminating the only source of drinking water on coral atolls. Coastal erosion is eating away at shorelines. Reefs are bleaching from warming ocean temperatures, which kills the coral and removes the natural barrier that protects islands from storm surge. Food security is threatened because traditional crops can't handle the saltwater intrusion and the changing weather patterns. Micronesians are watching their homeland slowly sink, and the countries responsible for most of the carbon emissions, the US, China, Europe, are offering thoughts and prayers instead of meaningful action. FSM officials have become advocates on the international stage, pushing for climate action at UN conferences, pointing out that for them this isn't politics or economics, it's survival, and the world nods sympathetically and then goes back to burning fossil fuels. Cultural preservation is another battle. The younger generation is Americanized. They speak English better than their native languages. They know more about American pop culture than traditional navigation or oral histories. Traditional practices are maintained in ceremonies, but daily life is thoroughly modern. Christianity is dominant. Traditional religion is mostly gone. The navigation knowledge that once allowed Micronesians to cross thousands of kilometers of open ocean using only stars and wave patterns is nearly lost. There are revival efforts, cultural programs, language classes, attempts to document oral traditions before the last elders who remember them die. But it's an uphill fight. Modernity is seductive. It's easier. It's connected to the wider world. And when your economic survival depends on participating in a global economy that doesn't value traditional knowledge, that knowledge becomes a hobby rather than a necessity. The question, what does it mean to be Micronesian in the 21st century, doesn't have an easy answer. It's complicated, layered, contested, and evolving in real time. The fishing rights that come with independence are valuable but difficult to manage. The FSM has an exclusive economic zone extending 200 nautical miles from its coasts, and because the islands are so scattered, the EEZ is massive. It's some of the most productive tuna fishing grounds in the world. Foreign fishing fleets pay licensing fees to fish there, important revenue. But illegal fishing is rampant. The FSM doesn't have the naval capacity to patrol such a vast area. Ships fish without licenses or underreport their catch. Climate change is affecting fish stocks, and the FSM is negotiating from weakness because they need the fees but can't enforce the rules. Geopolitically, the FSM is navigating between great powers again. China is offering development aid and infrastructure investment to Pacific Island nations, competing with the US for influence. The FSM recognizes Taiwan instead of China, which is a diplomatic alignment that matters in the great power competition playing out across the Pacific. The US is concerned about China's growing presence. China is concerned about US military dominance, and Micronesia is, once again, a strategic location that powerful countries want to control, or at least keep out of rival hands. It's the same dynamic that's defined Micronesian history since European contact. Small islands, big ocean, great powers with strategic interests. Micronesians have gotten very good at navigating these dynamics, extracting what they can from relationships with powerful patrons while trying to maintain autonomy. But it's exhausting. And the power imbalance means they're always the junior partner, always negotiating from weakness, always one policy shift away from being abandoned or ignored. Healthcare is a crisis. Diabetes rates are epidemic, driven by a shift from traditional diets to imported processed food. Obesity is rampant. Non-communicable diseases are the leading causes of death. Medical facilities are limited. Serious cases require evacuation, which is expensive and often delayed. Traditional medicine knowledge is declining. It's a public health disaster happening in slow motion, and addressing it requires systemic changes to diet, lifestyle, and healthcare infrastructure, none of which are easy when you're economically dependent, geographically isolated, and dealing with a dozen other crises simultaneously. The Compact's economic provisions were renewed in 2003 and are set to expire again in the 2020s. Negotiations are ongoing about what comes next. The US established a trust fund that's supposed to eventually replace direct aid, but it's unclear if the fund will be large enough to cover the FSM's needs. The future relationship is uncertain. The FSM needs a sustainable economic model that doesn't depend on US generosity, but building that model requires time, investment, and political will, all of which are in short supply. Meanwhile, the islands are slowly being depopulated by migration, threatened by climate change, and struggling with governance, infrastructure, healthcare, and education challenges that would be daunting for a wealthy nation and are nearly overwhelming for a poor one. Independence was supposed to be the beginning of self-determination. In practice, it's been the beginning of a long, complicated struggle to figure out how to survive as a tiny nation in a world that doesn't care very much if you make it or not. Chapter 6. What happens next when everything is uncertain? So here we are, 2026. The Federated States of Micronesia is 40 years old, which in nation years is barely adulthood. The population is somewhere around 100 to 115,000 people, though census data is unreliable and the number is probably declining because more Micronesians live abroad than at home. The outer islands are emptying out. Young people are moving to state capitals Weno, Colonia, Tofol, Leilu looking for jobs, schools, connectivity, and the really ambitious ones are leaving entirely. Hawaii, Guam, the US mainland. There's a significant Micronesian community in Arkansas, of all places, which is one of those migration patterns that makes no geographic sense until you realize that people go where there's work and where family has already established a foothold. The diaspora sends money back. Remittances keep families afloat, but every person who leaves is a person who's not building a future in Micronesia. It's a slow hemorrhage, and nobody's figured out how to stop it. COVID hit in 2020, and the FSM did something smart and devastating at the same time. They closed the borders. Completely. No flights in or out. Keep the virus out, keep people safe. And it worked. For almost 2 years, Micronesia was one of the few places on Earth with 0 COVID cases. But closing the borders meant no tourism, which was already minimal, and disrupted shipping, which is how everything gets to the islands. The economy tanked, government revenues dropped, people lost jobs, and then in 2022, The virus finally arrived anyway. It spread through communities that had no immunity and limited healthcare capacity. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Vaccination campaigns were challenging because of logistics and hesitancy. The economic recovery has been slow. It's the kind of crisis that exposes all the fragilities, the dependence on imports, the weak healthcare system, the lack of economic diversification. You survive, but it costs you. Governance continues to be a challenge. Corruption is a problem, though it's not worse than in many small island nations where everyone knows everyone and politics is deeply personal. Patronage is common. Nepotism happens. Transparency is limited. The civil service is underfunded and understaffed, partly because qualified people leave for better paying jobs abroad. Institutional capacity is weak, and the federal structure means the national government has limited power to address state-level issues. Chuuk still periodically talks about secession. The arguments are always the same. They're the most populous state. They don't get their fair share of resources. They'd be better off on their own. The referendums keep failing, but the resentment persists. It's hard to build a cohesive nation when the states barely identify with each other, and the whole thing was assembled by historical accident and foreign convenience. Infrastructure remains a chronic issue. There have been improvements, new government buildings, some road repairs, upgraded ports funded by the Compact and international aid. But maintenance is poor. Things deteriorate quickly in the tropical climate. Roads crack, buildings mould, equipment breaks and there's no budget to fix it. Ports are still inadequate for large vessels. Airports are basic, with limited international connections. Electricity is expensive because it's mostly diesel generators, and fuel has to be imported. There are some renewable energy projects, solar panels, small wind turbines, but they're limited in scale and constantly need maintenance that may or may not happen. It's the infrastructure of a poor country in a harsh environment with limited resources and declining aid. You make do, you improvise, but it's exhausting. Education is widely available at the elementary level, but quality varies wildly. High schools exist, but teacher quality is inconsistent and materials are outdated. The College of Micronesia on Pohnpei offers some degree programs, with satellite campuses on other islands, but it's underfunded and limited in scope. Students who want a university education usually go abroad to Guam, Hawaii, the mainland if they can afford it. Many don't come back. Literacy rates are decent on paper, but functional literacy is lower. Kids can read English, but comprehension is often weak, and they're losing their native languages. The education system teaches in English, which is practical for economic participation but means another generation growing up disconnected from their linguistic heritage. It's the slow death of culture through policy, well-intentioned but devastating. The economy is still heavily dependent on aid. Compact funding has been the backbone of government revenue for decades, but it's declining in real terms and the future is uncertain. The trust fund that was supposed to eventually replace direct aid isn't generating enough income to cover the budget. The private sector is tiny. The government is the largest employer, which is not a sign of a healthy economy. Fishing license fees bring in revenue, but they're volatile and subject to climate impacts on fish stocks. Tourism has potential. Chuuk's wreck diving is world-class. Nan Madol is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The natural beauty is undeniable, but the infrastructure isn't there. Marketing is minimal, and getting to Micronesia is expensive. Economic growth is minimal to negative. The standard of living is stagnant, and the pathway to a sustainable, independent economy is unclear. Climate change is the existential threat, not in the abstract future, now. Some atolls are already experiencing regular flooding during high tides and storm surges. Salt water is contaminating freshwater lenses. Coastal erosion is eating away shorelines. Reefs are bleaching from warming ocean temperatures, which removes the natural barrier that protects islands from waves. Traditional crops are failing because of saltwater intrusion and changing rainfall patterns. Food security is threatened, and the projections are dire. Some islands may become uninhabitable within decades. The FSM is vocal at international climate conferences, advocating for loss and damage compensation, for emissions reductions, for acknowledgement that this is a crisis caused by wealthy nations and suffered by poor ones. But advocacy doesn't stop the water from rising. Climate adaptation projects, seawalls, mangrove restoration, relocation planning are happening, but they're expensive and the international funding is inadequate. Migration is increasingly seen as adaptation. Climate refugees aren't a future problem. They're a present reality being negotiated in real time. The relationship with the United States is complicated and transactional. The compact is under renegotiation. The economic provisions expired in the early 2020s, and the new terms are being worked out. The US still has strategic interest in Micronesia. Denying access to China is the primary concern, and the military wants continued rights. But economic support is declining in real terms, and there's uncertainty in the US Congress about whether the compacts of free association are worth the cost. For the FSM, the calculus is brutal. They need the aid, they need the migration rights, they need the security guarantee. But the relationship is increasingly one-sided. The US gets strategic denial and military access. The FSM gets money that's not enough to build a sustainable economy and a promise of defense against threats that are mostly hypothetical, while the real threat, climate change, is being ignored. China is offering an alternative: infrastructure deals, development aid, no strings attached financing. It's tempting. The FSM is cautious because they're aware of the debt-trap diplomacy that's ensnared other small nations. But they're also aware that competition between great powers gives them leverage. They recognize Taiwan instead of China, which is a diplomatic stance that matters in the great power competition. The US pressures them to reject Chinese investment. China offers money the FSM desperately needs, and Micronesia once again is navigating between empires, trying to extract maximum benefit without getting crushed. It's a game they've been playing for over a century, and they've gotten good at it. But it's still a game played from a position of weakness, and the stakes keep getting higher. Youth culture is a mix of tradition and globalization. Young Micronesians have smartphones, they're on social media, they listen to American pop music. Some are creating their own content. There's a small but growing hip-hop scene. Micronesian artists blending traditional elements with modern sounds. Christianity is still dominant, but it's more cultural than devout for many. Traditional ceremonies happen, but they're increasingly performances for preservation rather than living practices. The identity is complex. Are they American, Micronesian, both, neither? The answer depends on context. The younger generation is navigating this complexity in real time, trying to figure out what it means to be Micronesian in the 21st century, when the traditional culture is fading and the modern culture is borrowed from elsewhere. Health challenges continue. Diabetes is epidemic. Obesity rates are among the highest in the world. Non-communicable diseases are the leading causes of death. The shift from traditional diets to imported processed food has been catastrophic. Medical facilities are limited. Serious cases require evacuation to Guam or Hawaii, which costs thousands. COVID exposed how fragile the healthcare system is. Mental health is an emerging crisis. Suicide rates are concerning. Substance abuse is common. The social determinants of health are all pointing in the wrong direction. Environmental degradation is ongoing and multifaceted. Overfishing in some areas, plastic pollution everywhere, no recycling infrastructure, so it accumulates. Waste management inadequate. Sewage treatment minimal, meaning waste goes directly into lagoons and reefs. Reef damage accelerating from climate and local impacts. Invasive species disrupting ecosystems. Abandoned vehicles rust in the jungle. Buildings deteriorate and aren't demolished, just left to decay. It's the environmental impact of poverty and limited governance capacity. People are trying to survive, and environmental protection is a luxury they can't afford. The irony is that degradation undermines the natural systems, reefs, fisheries, forests that survival depends on. Some things persist. Sakau culture on Pohnpei is still strong. The Sakau bars Nas are social centres where men gather to drink the mildly psychoactive beverage and talk for hours. The traditional protocols are maintained. It survived colonialism, Christianity and modernization because it's adaptable. You can drink Sakau and be modern. It's a bridge between tradition and the present. It's a small thing, but in the context of so much cultural loss, these small things matter. Land tenure is a constant source of conflict. Traditional ownership systems are complex and matrilineal. Customary law and modern legal systems don't always align. Disputes are common. Foreign investors can't own land, which limits development but preserves Micronesian control. It's one of those structural challenges without easy solutions, because any change threatens someone's interests. The diaspora is enormous relative to the home population. Some estimates suggest more Micronesians live abroad than in the FSM. Communities in Hawaii, Guam, Arkansas, California, Washington, they send money, they visit when they can. But for the second generation born abroad, the homeland is an abstraction, a place their parents are from. The remittances are crucial for families back home, but they create dependency. The economy runs partly on money sent by people who had to leave to earn it. There are signs of hope. Cultural revival movements, traditional navigation being taught again, language preservation programs in schools, climate advocacy gaining international attention, regional cooperation strengthening, youth engaging in politics. There's resilience, there's adaptation. Micronesians have survived centuries of colonialism, war, disease, and disasters. They're still here. That counts for something. But the existential questions are real and unanswerable. What is the FSM in 50 years? Will it still exist as a sovereign nation, or will economic dependency and climate change force some kind of integration with a larger power? Will the atolls be habitable, or will sea level rise make them uninhabitable and turn the population into permanent climate refugees? Can the economy become sustainable without aid, or is dependency the permanent condition of small island nations in a globalized world? Can the culture survive modernization, or will Micronesian identity become a diaspora memory disconnected from place? What does Micronesian even mean going forward when the traditional culture is mostly gone and the modern culture is globalized? There are no easy answers, only uncertainty and adaptation. The FSM is navigating a future that wasn't supposed to look like this. Independence was supposed to mean self-determination, economic development, cultural preservation. Instead, it's meant managing decline, adapting to crises, and trying to survive in a world that doesn't particularly care if small island nations make it or not. The Micronesians who navigate by stars and wave patterns, who built cities out of basalt without wheels or draft animals, who survived colonialism by 4 different empires, they're still here. They're adapting, they're resilient, but resilience has limits, and the challenges keep coming. Climate change, economic stagnation, cultural erosion, geopolitical pressures, The ocean that once connected them to the world now threatens to swallow them entirely. And the world watches, sympathetic but distant, offering thoughts and prayers and inadequate funding while the water rises and the future becomes increasingly uncertain. So if you're listening to this from somewhere safe and dry and economically stable, remember, Micronesia is not a hypothetical. It's 100,000 people living on islands that might not be habitable in a few decades because of emissions produced mostly by wealthy nations. It's a culture that survived 3,000 years of isolation only to be eroded by a century of colonialism and globalization. It's a democracy trying to function under conditions that would challenge any nation. It's an improbable country built on improbable geography, held together by history and necessity and a refusal to disappear. The story isn't over. The ending isn't written. But the ink is running out, the pages are getting wet, and nobody seems to have a plan for what comes next. That's Micronesia. That's where we are. And if you learned something tonight, if you're thinking about these islands differently than you were an hour ago, then maybe that's worth something. Thanks for listening. Sleep well, and maybe, just maybe, give a damn about small island nations while there's still time to make a difference.